My name's Travis Alexander. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in medical humanities at Rice University, and I work on the Translational Humanities for Public Health project. One of the people who submitted their research to that project has joined us today. That's Dr. Elena Conis, who's an associate professor in the Graduate School of Journalism and the Department of History at UC Berkeley. Dr. Conis is a historian, but also a writer addressing a broad array of issues pertinent to the medical humanities. And she's been kind enough to join us today to talk to us a little bit about her work. So with that preamble, Dr. Conis, could you tell us a little bit about your educational background and what led you into what we can broadly call the medical humanities?
Sure, that takes us kind of back a ways, but I'm happy to. Thanks for having me, Travis. I am, as you mentioned, a historian of medicine, a field that I got into almost kind of by accident. I started graduate school in the field of public health, and I was working on my public health degree on the wonderful Berkeley campus where there were so many other enticing classes to take, and I ended up taking a class in the journalism school, added an entire degree, worked as a health reporter for a while. And then one of the projects I worked on as a health reporter was I wrote a history column, a weekly history column for the Los Angeles Times. This was in the early 2000s. It was called Esoterica Medica. And I ended up interviewing many historians of medicine and uncovering fascinating stories, backstories to many of the current health and medical topics that we were covering for our readers. And I had no idea there was such a thing as a historian of medicine. So after a few years of that, I went and got a PhD in the field myself. I was previously on the faculty of the Department of History at Emory University and joined the Berkeley faculty about 5 years ago in 2016. I entered the field of history of medicine right at the moment when we were having a kind of national debate about the HPV vaccine, the very first HPV vaccine that was introduced, which was Merck's Gardasil vaccine. And I found it so interesting that the introduction of this vaccine, but more importantly, the proposal to make it mandatory for girls who were, I think the initial proposals were girls entering 6th grade, was so contentious and ended up sparking an enormous cultural kind of debate. And I decided to try to approach the current debate from a historical perspective to sort of see what the historical antecedents were to it and to look at how it fit into the broader history of vaccination. And that ended up becoming an almost 10-year project to look at how the early 21st century discourse around vaccination compared to, evolved out of, and related to our longer 200 history year of vaccination in the US. My first book that came out of that was Vaccination, published in 2015. And what I did in that project, that book, was I asked sort of two starting questions. My starting questions were, how is it that in the early 21st century, vaccination had become so contentious at the same exact time that it had become so remarkably well accepted? And this was only 15 years ago that I asked this question, so it's kind of hard to believe to some extent today that 15 years ago I was able to say, like, look at how well accepted vaccination is. But at that time, I guess it wasn't quite 15 years ago, it was just over 10 years ago, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention was releasing numbers showing that US school children were remarkably well vaccinated. We had achieved some of the highest levels of childhood vaccine coverage, honestly, in US history. So this was historically unprecedented. Around, let's say, 2008, 2010, we were vaccinating more kids against more infectious diseases with more vaccine doses than we ever had before as a nation. So I was curious to know how it is that we arrived at this place defined by this paradox: enormous acceptance and enormous doubt about vaccination. The very, very short answer to that is, well, as you can imagine, twofold, since it's a twofold question. On the one hand, this acceptance was born of enormous federal involvement and increasing federal authority in the realm of vaccination, and in particular, childhood vaccination. It was also a result of what I've come to think of as the reframing of vaccine preventable diseases. We took a variety of diseases, including some that used to be commonplace and thought of as not terribly important diseases like, and I'll say this by emphasizing measles and mumps, which in the mid 20th century had kind of not as much urgency as they spark today. And we had put diseases like that, which were, again, at that mid-century moment, referred to often as the mild diseases. We put them on a level playing field with diseases like smallpox, polio, and diphtheria, the previous targets of childhood vaccination. And so we had these kind of simultaneous processes kind of encouraging vaccination. And at the same time, we had a host of social movements taking shape and gaining acceptance, visibility, and also authority from the 60s and 70s, which happened to also be decades in which we turned increasingly to using the force of law, using state level mandates to not just encourage, but require children to get vaccinated in order to enroll in school. So we have increased federal support, the reframing of vaccine preventable diseases, increased use of mandates at the state level that target children and their vaccination status, at the same time that we have social movements like the civil rights movement, the disability rights movements, environmental movement, women's rights and women's health movement, and the like, which ended up bringing more and more scrutiny, not just to vaccines themselves, but to the professionals who were recommending them, to the companies that were producing them, and to the interests that were behind not just their use, but their mandatory use, such that by the 1980s, we had a very robust and very active self-defined vaccine safety movement pressing for more critical engagement with the approval, oversight, and use of vaccines in the US. And things have just kind of grown from there, to make a long story short. We're living today, I think, in a moment that represents somewhat of a turning point in the vaccination landscape. COVID has definitely changed our relationship with vaccination, and it has hastened a change that was already happening. In brief, what I focused on when I was working on Vaccination was childhood vaccination, because that had become so much of a national focus from the 1950s, when we developed the first or approved the first polio vaccine, up until the early 2000s, when we declared the very common, once common childhood disease measles eliminated from the US. But in the 21st century, we started focusing more and more on the vaccination of adults again. And we started focusing more and more on vaccination kind of across the life course. And that was kind of the backstory to, part of the backstory to where we found ourselves now, facing a new infectious disease that we have developed a vaccine for in record time. And now that we're grappling with how to create incentives and requirements to ensure that those vaccines are used as widely as possible, again, not just by children, but by as many members of the population as we can.
Do you think the are the hesitancies that we see around the COVID vaccine specifically, do you see them as outgrowths of the kind of hesitancy that you point out to having been really incubated as far back as the 80s? Or is it, in other words, like, are we looking at a difference in degree or a difference in kind from that skepticism to today's? And if so, how?
That's a really good question. And let me say very briefly, both. But let me also say that vaccine skepticism or vaccination skepticism or hesitancy has been around as long as vaccines have been around, and has tended to be amplified by the use of compulsion to encourage or require vaccination of a population. So going back to the 80s is not nearly far enough. You've got to go back to the 1790s to understand the roots of resistance to vaccination. And to make, again, another very long story short, what we see really in the very, very tail end of the 18th century and all through the 19th century are a handful of familiar and often repeated objections about vaccination, that it's a risky procedure, that when it is enforced, it abridges the rights of individuals to make their own decisions about their own health care, and that sometimes its mandatory use is in conflict with religious or spiritual beliefs. What we see in the 20th century is the continuation of these three familiar objections, and the addition in the late 20th century of concerns about, and actually not the late 20th century, the early 20th century, and in fact the late 19th century, we start to see concerns about, again, the interests behind the vaccines, their manufacture, their promotion, and their administration. And what we do see by the late 20th century are then concerns about the constituents of, or the components of vaccination. What are the ingredients, and what are those ingredients capable of in people? What the social movements of the latter 20th century also bring to light, in a much more kind of hard to ignore way, are the specific concerns brought by members of the population who feel like their own interests were not taken into account, in the kind of application of vaccine mandates, and in some cases the testing and development of vaccines. To kind of talk about this more specifically, what you start to see are groups of people saying that vaccines were developed with technologies that violate their own personal beliefs, or that vaccines have been used in forcible and racist ways in the past, and that vaccination today carries that legacy with it. So what we see by the early 21st century is that we're really carrying all of this baggage with us into the current moment, in which we are again seeing some of these 19th century arguments, in particular the rights-based ones, also inflamed by the particular political moment that we're living in, a moment in which our politics are extraordinarily polarized, and in which vaccination and the state have kind of taken on a new symbolism too.
Could you talk a little bit about the state of vaccine mandates today, and why they may be counterproductive, especially in COVID? I mean, maybe just as the newest example of a plan that has not worked before.
Yeah, so let me preface my answer to this by saying that vaccination, again, has always been contentious, but more so, it seems, when it's been made compulsory. And yet, compulsory vaccination has been very effective in encouraging larger numbers of individuals to become vaccinated. But it's also very effective in drawing out fiercer resistance from those individuals already inclined to resist. So you're always going to get, it seems to me, two things when you turn to mandates. You're going to get more acceptance, and you're going to get more resistance, as a matter of course. We've used different types of mandates historically to encourage vaccination. Going back to the smallpox era, you can also find examples of mandates that were not uniformly enforced. And this is, again, part of the sort of troubling past that vaccination carries with it in the present. In recent history, we've relied a lot on school-based mandates and workplace mandates that have largely applied to people in specific types of workforces, such as the healthcare setting or the military. What we've seen with COVID is a complete expansion of the use of workplace mandates and the kind of lagging school mandates, which aren't going into effect as quickly, interestingly, as they were proposed, say, with HPV, where we started this conversation a few minutes ago. We introduced, or were introduced to the first HPV vaccine in a moment in which one of its target diseases, cervical cancer, wasn't widely popularly known as a public health emergency or as an epidemic kind of on everybody's radar. And yet we move very quickly to introduce mandates. We're doing something very different, it seems to me, with child vaccination for COVID today. I'm trying to think if there was one other thing that I want to say in response to that, but I think I've lost it.
Well, yeah, I guess just by way of some conclusion, then I know you've written about these issues not just in your book, but in some recent pieces for journalistic outlets. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about some recent pieces where we can find them, and then if you've got anything coming out soon that we can keep an eye out for.
Sure, absolutely. So my work on the history of vaccination has evolved a bit to include looking at the long history of a few of the target infections, namely measles and mumps. And it's also evolved to include the study of the personal belief exemption to vaccine mandates. Since we first started introducing mandates back in the 19th century, states and before that cities that introduced mandates would sometimes include exemption clauses saying who did not have to get vaccinated. Typically it was people with medical reasons for not getting vaccinated, but a few states more than 100 years ago also included belief exemptions. If you don't believe in vaccination or you are conscientiously or morally opposed, you would be exempt. And that exemption has a very long and poorly understood history as a legislative tool, which I've written about in a few journal articles and also just touched upon in a recent op-ed in the Washington Post. And I also have been studying at the same time an entirely different topic, which actually grew out of my study of the history of vaccination. I've been studying the history of the pesticide DDT, which has been sort of an iconic example held up historically by vaccine skeptics to say, why should we trust authorities? They make mistakes. Why should we trust scientists? They make mistakes. Look at the example of DDT. And so I have a new book on the history of that pesticide and how its story has been wielded in many different ways over time. That'll be coming out this spring.
And what's that book going to be called?
That book is called How to Sell a Poison, and it will be published with Bold Type Books.
All right. Well, thanks for giving us some of your time to talk about this. I will be looking forward to picking up your book on DDT and hope everyone else will too. So with that said, thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you so much, Travis. It was a pleasure.